Hello, I'm Angela Adams with Angela Adams Consulting. And I want to introduce you, if you don't already know, Ryan Smith with Rhodian. Ryan and I talked a bit at the NetView Accelerate conference about the importance of cybersecurity. And we were talking specifically about our clients and uh, more specifically, even still, our accounting clients and how we could work together to help protect our clients in today's environment. Ryan?
Yeah, well, Angela, it's very great to be here. Appreciate you having me and for everybody joining us today. Again, my name is Ryan Smith. I'm VP of Sales and Marketing with Rhodian Group. We're an integrated IT and cybersecurity firm that helps insurance agencies simplify IT, cybersecurity, and compliance for their business. We've been around for a while. You might have known us before as Rigid Cybersecurity or Adar IT. But yeah, this is a very popular topic right now, and I think something that agencies today are really struggling with a lot of times just because there's so many outside influences. There's laws coming from every different direction. There's requirements coming from companies. Insureds are starting to ask more about this stuff, and we're seeing agencies get attacked. So I think it's very timely conversation to be having today.
And thank you, Ryan, for spending your time with us and our clients on this. I think one of the things that causes agency owners to a little bit bury their heads in the sand about this threat is it's a lot to take in. It's an elephant, right? And that's kind of the metaphor you and I started talking about. And it's easier just to ignore it than to deal with it. And so when you and I started talking about eating this elephant one bite at a time, that metaphor kind of stuck with us.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I think is important to bring into this conversation is that for agency owners or any business owner, there's always a struggle between being secure, which we all strive to be, and being efficient and giving good customer service. And those things at first glance seem to be on opposite ends of the spectrum. And it's important that business owners make a conscientious decision about where they fall on this spectrum. Because if you leave it to account managers, they're always going to go to the side of being most efficient and giving great customer service. And an example that we've talked about in every agency I've ever walked into, somewhere there's somebody who has a customer's credit card written on a Post-it note, hopefully hidden, but not always. I've seen them stuck to monitors, right? That's not at all secure. And we all know that. But it's easy. The customer's happy because we don't have to bug them to get it. It's more efficient. We can just pop it in when we need to. It's both things on this end of the spectrum. It's easy and it's better customer service. But everybody can see that it's not secure.
Yeah, human nature is really kind of the enemy of security in a lot of ways. And attackers know that too, so that's why they try to play with us with social engineering attacks and phishing. They want to trick us and play on that kind of willingness to help or take shortcuts. But yeah, there is definitely a scale there between efficiency and security. We talk about that a lot because you could have a really efficient environment where everything's very accessible, it's quick to get to, information's readily available, but then anybody could get to it. So as we start to go to the opposite side, we could really lock this down. We could have a very secure environment. I could dig a hole and throw your computer in the hole and fill it with cement. It's going to be a lot more secure, but you're not going to get anything done. So we can't exist on either end of that spectrum. We have to think about where we fit. And somewhere in there, there's a bottom line for where our compliance tells us we have to be. And then there's our culture where we have to decide where we want to be from there. And so that's, I think, where a lot of people need to decide is, what does that mean for us? And then why are we giving up this efficiency and what for? And I think if people started on the secure end and they started to give away that security, they'd probably be a little less likely to be comfortable giving it away, and they'd be more likely to hold on to it. It's kind of like after wearing a seatbelt for years and years and years, all of a sudden driving around without one, you might feel a little insecure there. And I think if we were thinking about it from this end of the spectrum, people would have a different approach about what they do with those credit card numbers. But unfortunately, we come from a world where we didn't have a lot of security in, and when we add it, we're taking things away from people, and it hurts. And I think from the culture standpoint, the best things that we can do are educate people about these topics so that way they understand why there was a change. We're giving up efficiency, but we're doing it for a good reason. And I think once people understand that, the culture comes behind it, and that's where you can start to work on the other end of the spectrum, where you really want to be to protect your business and your people.
And I think as business owners, we send mixed signals. And I think to have an effective change, agency owners need to be clear on where that cultural balance point is for them and what they want for their agency.
Yeah, visibility and clarity is very important there. We've had offices that have worked with us that once they started to talk, with their staff more about why they're doing those things and start to explain, the practices that they're putting in place and all the effort IT is putting into this kind of stuff, people start to rally behind that a little bit more. They have a little bit more of an understanding. So visibility is extremely important there.
So let's talk a little about cybersecurity basics and the importance of having a cybersecurity policy. Ryan, what are you seeing in this arena? What are
Yeah.
agencies doing?
Well, and I'll give a little, just real high level cybersecurity 101, because I think a lot of times this topic comes up and it's intimidating. So a lot of people shut down. So I like to simplify this a little bit for everybody. And what's great is this works really great in context of risk management. So there's some really good ways to explain this for people in insurance. But really, when we think about cybersecurity, we're talking about risks in our systems and our technology and environment. So when we start to think about those, there are two key factors that go into a risk: the likelihood or probability, and then the impact, the damage done if something happens. And so when we think about that in cybersecurity terms, the likelihood really comes down to what vulnerabilities are there. How could a system get attacked? And there's a couple things that make it easier to attack. Do a lot of people know that weaknesses exist there? Do they know how to find it? And if they find them, do they know how to attack them? And then kind of counter to that, are there ways we can stop that or protect it? Do we have layers of defense? On the impact side, it's really comes around a couple things. Some things are surprises when it comes to cybersecurity impacts, but the things that we can proactively think about are the CIA of cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. A lot of people, when they think about cybersecurity risks, they're thinking about confidentiality. They're thinking about the data they need to protect. But what sometimes gets missed, and I know what's important to you, are some of these other things, Angela. So integrity. Can I trust the information in my system? Can I trust that routing number somebody sent me? Do I know that that's where I'm actually supposed to send money to? Does somebody manipulate that? Availability, the third part, is what does it mean for my office if we have to basically restore all of our environment and we're down for a week? What is that week of operations going to do for me? Now, those three things we can think about as far as how we use the technology. For example, our email. We might have some sensitive information in there, but chances are that's really critical for the availability of our business to run. So that might have different impacts than other systems that maybe compared to something like a management system like AMS 360. Of course, there's a lot of sensitive data there. It's very critical for the integrity to be there, and it's also important for that to be there to run your business. So that one hits all three marks. That's going to be a high risk. So when you start to think about it in that context, it makes it a lot easier to start to think about what you do next. So I like to point that out a little bit because that comes into play a little bit with just that scale we were talking about, efficiency and security. You have to understand that because risk, there's no such thing as this black or white, we're secure, we're not. We have to think about it in these different levels, and we have to make decisions about how we mitigate those levels. And so that's really the importance of having that policy figured out in your office. And not just the cyber liability policy, but policy and procedures around your cybersecurity program. So making sure that you understand your risks, that you're talking about the best practices that you've put in place, and sometimes those are requirements by compliance, and then you think about what you do if something goes wrong. What happens if you're impacted by a breach? And so those are really kind of the key components that agencies need to be putting in place for a cybersecurity program. And then, of course, cyber liability is always going to be a part of that conversation. It's kind of two sides of the same coin where, part of it is ensuring you against the financial loss and the resources to recover. And the other side is just preventative measure to hopefully avoid the claim altogether.
So you mentioned routing numbers, and I know that's one that we get hit with a lot. Some unscrupulous person will go to our website, get the email addresses for all of our accounting people, and send them emails that appear to be from me, asking them to click on a link and transfer money. And fortunately, we're very aware of that and watch for it. But we also have a fear that we might get a request like that from a client to transfer money. And obviously, we want to be responsive to our clients. And if they are asking us to transfer money to do it, but we've set up a policy internally that we won't do that without confirming via a phone call, because we know these kind of scams exist. So our rule internally for our accounting clients is we will transfer money to Travelers Insurance Company, will Travelers money transfer money between an agency's own accounts. But anytime we get a off the wall request like that, we're going to require that we verify it with a phone call to the agency owner. That's not efficient. It's not great customer service, because they may really want money transferred available and we can't get them on the phone for an hour, and we're not going to do it, right? But that's something we see as a very big risk. And so that's something we built into our policies.
And this, yeah, and I'd say from your perspective with the accounting role that you play, I'd say integrity again is going to be a very important part. I mean, there's confidential information. You probably maybe have some internal knowledge about a business's operations and things like that that they don't want public, but it's not like you have a whole list of, social security numbers. Well, maybe that, but you don't have all the health information and other things. So, the confidentiality is a component for you, but integrity is a big part of what you do, is making sure that things are going to the right place and you can trust what you're working on. So I think it's good that you've identified that. So I'd say it's high likelihood, because I think it's very clear from looking at your business from the outside that you do this. So you're going to be a bit of a target there. It's somewhat of an easy attack, and you can be really lazy about it by just mimicking your email and hoping you get somebody that's having a busy day and maybe they just jump on it and take care of it and don't think about it. But again, you're countering that weakness, that vulnerability in that process, by making sure you have a process or a layer of security to verify that the right person is doing this. And so you hear the term or the phrase a lot, trust but verify. So it's good to assume, okay, this is probably a legitimate message, but I'm just going to do that double check just to make sure that I don't make any mistakes here. And it's a tough one. Like you said, it's not necessarily the best from a customer service standpoint, but if your customers understand this policy ahead of time and they understand why it's in place and that it's there to protect them, then hopefully they're going to be more accepting when you are reaching out to verify this stuff, because now they know why you're doing it and they are actually watching you actively protecting them.
So a lot of times agencies will say all of my data is in AMS 360, which is hosted, so I don't need to worry about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a big confusion I think a lot of people have. And this we can kind of spend some time on if you want to get into trust models. There's a lot there, but when you're using a third party like an AMS 360 or even Microsoft, your emails in Microsoft 365 and Outlook, you're trusting that third party with that information that they're hosting. Now, what happens with something like the management system or any other third party tool an agency is using, if I'm the insured, I don't know who Vertafore is. I could care less. The way I always think about it is I gave you my data. If a breach happens on your watch, I blame you. I don't necessarily know who you gave it to or what you did with it. And because of that, there's the responsibility for the agency to be looking at those third parties you use, even if it's Microsoft, even if it's Vertafore Applied or whoever it might be, even if you have that reputation of them having a good practice for security, for legal purposes and to show your due diligence, you need to collect information to show you've checked that that is a good vendor to work with. So companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, like these big ones, you're not going to call Bill Gates and ask for his security paperwork, but these companies have that information available. So you can download it. Even at Vertafore, I worked there in the past, and one of the things that I would have to do almost every 6 months for some bank-owned agencies was run these reports and provide details on the SOC 2 compliance and security practices and all that. So this is a practice these companies are used to following, and it's actually good practice for every agency to start looking at anywhere they're putting data into a third-party system. It's their responsibility to make sure they can trust them and to verify that trust.
And I think Vertafore is completely trustworthy, but I do think we create vulnerabilities within that Vertafore environment by who we allow to access it.
Hmm.
So we may have an employee whose brother-in-law is a scammer, right?
Hmm.
And if we're letting that employee work from home, they leave Vertipore open and brother-in-law sneaks in and starts getting data. We've created a vulnerability, not Vertipore, right?
Hmm.
If we're using remote outsource companies that are overseas and we're giving them a login to our data, we're creating a vulnerability, not Vertipore,
Hmm.
by who we're giving those logins and passwords to. And there are some things within AMS 360 we can do, like
Hmm.
restricting the times that that login can access the data,
Hmm.
like reinforcing to our employees that they log out before they leave their computer if they're working from home. What are the other kinds of things in a secure environment like AMS 360 that are vulnerabilities that the agency needs to be addressing?
I love that question. I'm glad that you're thinking about that. And there's a few good things that you're hitting on there that I want to expand on too. One of the things you're talking about with controlling the access times, all these kind of settings, I think that's the case. I mean, with pretty much any third-party system you're using, you're going to find that there are security controls available to you to help tighten the security of that tool. But nothing's secure out of the box. You have to actually go in and turn these things on. The same for your Microsoft stuff, for your Vertipore stuff, all of those things. So it's very important to make sure you're aware of what those things are and understands your responsibility to do that. Because to your point with that brother-in-law, and maybe it's not the brother-in-law, maybe that network's compromised and there's an actual bad actor or a hacker in there. Somebody's, able to use your access. Vertipore doesn't know that's an unauthorized person. They've authenticated in, so they have no clue that that was wrong, and there's nothing raising any alarms on their end. That looks like normal access through your employee. But what you can do within some of these tools too is think about minimizing your digital footprint. So when we think about the impacts, I was talking about CIA, right? So you think about confidential information that person has access to. Does this person in the company need access to every account or maybe just those that they service? Do they need access to different department accounts? If they're in personal lines, do they need access to benefit accounts? These are questions to be thinking about with your security controls and the business units you can set up to make sure that you have those security controls turned on. But if you can minimize your impact, then if that person is compromised, it's a smaller breach. And one thing, just to kind of throw this out there, I hear a lot of agencies kind of say, well, I trust my staff. And I think that's good. And I think you should operate under a system of trust with them. But you also have to assume that trusted person could be compromised, to your point with the brother-in-law. So even though maybe you feel like you're taking something away from somebody you trust by minimizing their access, it's done for the sake of protecting the business. And it goes back to that scale you were talking about. It's maybe you feel like you're taking something away from that efficiency side to become more secure, but it's a necessary thing to do.
So multi-factor authentication plays in here as well, particularly in this example. And I know there's resistance to using it. And I will say
Yeah.
for our clients, it causes us problems, right? Because if we're getting to the end of the month and we need to have somebody help with your direct bill and we're having to do a multi-factor authentication, it makes it more difficult. If somebody's pitching in and helping with bank reconciliations and we need them authenticated, we know this is inconvenient. But the MFA is so important in providing protection. Can you speak a bit about the importance of that?
Yeah. So I'm sure everybody's heard MFA at this point, but just for a quick just introduction to some of this, multi-factor authentication means you're identifying yourself on more than one factor. Normally, it's just something it's just a password. But with multi-factor authentication, you're adding something you have. So it could be a phone, it could be a device, it could be your retina or your iris, it could be your fingerprint, maybe one day your DNA or something like that that validates you're you. So it's this other component of this that makes it that multi-factor authentication. Um, but yeah, that's a tough one. I hear a lot of pushback from people on it. In reality, though, for those of us that have been using it, you kind of get used to it after a while. It's just that first, you know, part of it where it feels more painful because you're having to authenticate in and jump through these extra hoops, but you start to get faster at it. But again, this goes back to the cultural side of cybersecurity, is making sure that people understand why you're doing this and how easy it is to compromise you without this in place. If somebody just, there's a lot of ways to steal credentials. Credentials can kind of end up out there through other people's attacks. So for example, companies like Marriott, just to pick on them, I guess, they had a breach several years ago. And if you had a Marriott account and you had your username and password in there, and that was part of that compromise, that password's out there now. And if you're somebody who had maybe a system where you're using similar passwords or using the same password everywhere, well, now that information can kind of help people find your other passwords. So if we can find that, and I'm looking at ways to maybe target you or using technology to really automate some kind of an attack across different emails and password variations, without MFA, I could really quickly just log right into your environment if I found the right place to do that. The Colonial Pipeline attack that shut down the gas for the East Coast for a couple weeks, a couple summers ago, that was somebody who was a former employee that was not disabled from their system when they left, that did not have MFA set up, that somebody just stumbled into. And they didn't even know who they had at the time. And then they launched a ransomware attack once they're in there. So these little things can turn into big attacks. But MFA is that one extra hurdle that makes it that much harder for them. And now it's not foolproof. Nothing in security is 100% secure because there's always going to be a level of risk with it. But it's going to make it that much harder and hopefully make them go off to the next person. And I was kind of thinking about the idea of, I don't need to outrun the bear, I need to outrun you. That's kind of what we're doing with these hackers, is trying to make us just less appealing than the next person, so they go on to the next person they want to attack. But MFA is one of those things where if you have people pushing back on it, I'd say explain to them a little bit about how some of these attacks can occur without it, and just how easy it is to stop them with this simple change. One thing you might want to know, and that might be helpful for viewers to think about, is that Microsoft is enforcing a change, and they're pushing MFA on all Microsoft accounts, which, in my opinion, is long overdue. I think if we would have done this a couple years ago, imagine how many business email compromises could have been stopped. But at the same time, this is something that's going to impact everybody listening. So if you're not already using an authenticator and setting that up with Microsoft, it's something you should probably start doing soon. Probably should have been doing, but Microsoft's going to be forcing you to do in the near future.
Kind of like seatbelt laws, right?
Yeah.
Forcing us into it.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of struggle with some of the forced regulations with certain things. I think like a company saying, hey, if you're going to use our system, you have to turn on MFA. That's a good change probably, because people should be using those tools. To your point, they might not know, Vertafore has some of these security settings, go use those. But, it's tough when some of these laws are saying you have to go do this stuff this way. I think that for a long time, they let businesses kind of do their own thing, but then all of a sudden we started seeing these attacks go through the roof. Now people are trying to do stuff to protect consumers. So it's getting to a point where we all have to do this stuff, unfortunately.
Ryan, I know Vertafore is encouraging agencies to use the multi-factor authentication and to use a program called Ping. What do you think of Ping, and is this something agencies should be using?
Yeah, and I first of all, it's a good move to enforce that. We were talking about Microsoft before, and they're making those changes as well. It is necessary for Vertafore to begin doing this. A lot of insurance data security laws require MFA for agencies, so they have to offer this, and they should. This is something that can stop a lot of attacks. My concern would be that people aren't using that. That goes back to that story again, where somebody could easily get your credentials and get in there. So definitely turn that on if you haven't already. And Ping, as far as Ping goes, that is definitely a recognized security tool. Now, with any kind of security tool out there, there's always risks. There are other password managers that have had attacks and things like that, but Ping's one that's been, at least in the the cybersecurity industry, somebody that I've known about for a very long time and has got a great reputation. And so I think, yeah, definitely using Ping is a great place to begin, and making sure that, again, you're not going towards some of these text or email-based MFA options is going to be even better. So definitely encourage people to use Ping.
And for our clients who are using multi-factor authentication, and we encourage them to do that with AMS 360 and use Ping, initially it was a struggle for us to get those codes. We have resolved that. We are now using Ping and multi-factor authentication with a lot of our clients, and it is something that we encourage clients to do. So another area is backup and how to recover data, because ransomware attacks, everybody knows somebody. who has been a victim of a ransomware attack. It's everywhere. And that's not a good time to find out that you don't have a good backup and recovery procedure.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think part of this, what might be helpful for people to know about when we think about attacks and how to minimize the cost, there are two key factors we want to look for: the mean time to detect and mean time to respond. So how long does it take me to detect an attack, and how long does it take me to respond and get it contained? And with the backup, that's one of those things that can get you recovered faster. If you have something you can restore, you can get your team back up and working. And so that minimizes the impact of availability. That means that you can actually, shorten that week maybe where you're offline because you had an attack and you have to restore everything. Maybe you can cut that back in half. So you've cut that particular cost down. Now, I've seen in the past with bad backup practices, a lot of different things happen. I've helped investigate attacks where somebody had a ransomware attack and their backup was stored in their office along with their POS server and all their accounting information. All of that was corrupted as part of the ransomware attack. So they were dead in the water. They had to pay the ransom in that case because they had no other choice of how to get their business back up and running. So part of it is making sure that you do backup in the right way to where it's also protected and segmented away from what you're doing. So cloud-based backup's a good idea. But the other thing that I see happen a lot is that people have had an attack and they go to restore and they've never tested it ever. And they find out there was a corrupted backup file or challenges with restoring it. So this is something else that I would tell people to consider, is not just make sure that you have a strong backup practice in place, but that you're testing it and you're restoring it on occasion to make sure that's working properly. Because all of those things are intended to get you back up and running faster and minimize that attack.
So what are some examples you've seen in agencies? Because again, agencies will say all of our data is in AMS 360. And number one, we know that's not true. We know CSRs are storing stuff on their desktops, and that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
So can you share some real examples of data that was not in the management system that caused a critical problem for an agency?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people assume what's in Microsoft, in SharePoint and OneDrive, that's going to be backed up and that Microsoft's going to have that indefinitely. There are a lot of limitations on just the standard licenses for Microsoft as far as what it's going to back up. That's why in our company, we offer certain backup and archiving tools to help with that. So things within your email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, all those places through Microsoft, even your desktop where you might have people saving things, a shared folder, anything that's happening outside of that management system, you certainly want to think about. And then as you look at your management system, this goes back to that due diligence of the third party you're trusting. It's kind of something you should be asking them about as well too. What happens if they get an attack? Is there a backup plan for that? How is your backup going to be managed if somebody has a massive breach? So that should be part of the security questions you ask those third parties when you do outsource that. But when it is internal, you do need to think about your own. But I do think there's a lot of advantages to using companies like Vertafore and using AMS 360 in the cloud. You have somebody that can probably protect that information a lot better than you. They're going to have a lot more money to put in the protections behind that kind of a program. They're going to have a lot better backup strategies in it. And so you can outsource a lot of that responsibility to them by having that kind of a trusted partner.
And then again, your responsibility there is making sure you're not giving access to AMS 360 to bad players unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else in the backup or recovery that you've seen? Have you seen an agency that really did a great job with recovery after a problem? Because again, we have two sides of it, right? We want to prevent it, number one,
Mm-hmm.
but if it happens, we need to recover from it. Do you
Mm-hmm.
have a success story of somebody who really did a good job recovering from a problem?
Yeah, I think what happens in these cybersecurity stories is that you don't hear about the successful stuff. You hear about the
Right.
bad things. But yeah, I mean, we have talked to people where they're, being diligent and they want to understand, hey, did we do everything right here? So here's a tip. If you ever have an attack and you are going to restore your backup, make sure that you preserve the evidence of what happened, because if we ever have to come in and investigate it, you could destroy all that evidence. And so that would be the one thing I'd say where I've seen people do okay, but not quite as well as we'd like to see, is they They think they contained the attack. Maybe they had somebody got into something they weren't supposed to, so they reset logins. They were able to enforce MFA, make sure everybody's in there, and end sessions that we're currently running, so that way everybody has to log back in now. So they're doing things to kick somebody out of an environment, and then they can come in and restore through the backup. So I've seen that happen. But where I've seen people fail still in that little spot is that they didn't capture evidence of what really occurred in the beginning. And so when they've done that restore, they've wiped over all of the evidence that we would use to figure out what originally happened. And that's important because of a couple reasons. One, I want to know what that person did when they were in there. Do we just see what we assumed, or was there more to it? To that point, I've seen people who had a email attack within the last few weeks. They didn't realize it, but their actually email attacks started 4 months ago. So in deeper analysis, we were able to figure out this goes back way farther. And I think the average over the last couple of years has been in the 200-day range of people being in systems before they're detected. So this could go back far. So you need to investigate. And you're also required by law to investigate. All 50 states have breach notification laws that say if there's a suspected incident, you need to do certain things. And if you confirm that it was a true incident, you need to report it to Attorney General. You might have to report it to the people impacted, maybe even credit bureaus. So there's a lot of things that need to happen, regardless of your backup. So I know I went a little off tangent there, but some good tips that I want to make sure people know. But yeah, I've seen definitely people have been successful putting their backup in and moving right back along. What you don't want, though, is that person to come right back in there and do the same thing again.
Yep. Yep. So what can we do to get employees more aware of what they should be doing?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one because, I think everybody goes towards security awareness training. It's a, obvious option right there. And it is very commonly a requirement, which, by the way, backup, MFA training, and some other things like endpoint detection and response are cyber liability requirements these days. So if you don't do these things, you're probably not going to get an insurance policy, and you might be out of compliance with the law. But with training, one of the biggest challenges is that you could do this training, and a lot of people might do a 60-minute training once a year, and then it goes in one ear and out the other, and people are right back to what their practices normally are. Or I see also people sometimes just say, every once in a while we get a phishing email, I'll sit down with the staff at the next stand-up meeting or whatever, and I'll run over what it was, and we'll kind of do a little ad hoc training. But when you don't have a formalized structure, what happens is you might miss some important things. It's not necessarily staying up to date with what current threats are. And then, like I said, it goes in one ear and out the other. So what I usually recommend are a couple of different approaches with training. One, think about breaking up into smaller bite-sized pieces, kind of sticking with your elephant metaphor that we're working with today, but doing that with the training too for the staff. So maybe instead of 60 minutes a year, do 15 minutes a quarter. But also think about when you're really busy. I know a lot of people push this off because in security in general, they'll say, look, we're in the middle of open enrollment. We can't touch any of this stuff right now. However, that's probably when you're more likely to get attacked because everybody's so busy. So before you get to those busy periods, accounting season, open enrollment, your 7-1 renewals, all of those kind of things that eat up our time and distract us, train before that so people go into that fresh with this stuff in their mind and they realize how this stuff gets used against them. The other tip I'll give is if you really want training to stick and you want people to understand why this stuff's so important, it goes back to what I was saying before. Help them understand why this stuff's important and give them tricks and tips on how to improve their own security at home. When people take cybersecurity home and they think about how to protect themselves and their families, it switches something a little bit different for them. And they start to understand more personally why this is important to do. And they'll start to take those behaviors they build at home into the office. And so as you start to build awareness around these things, think about ways that you can make this personal to them. And I guess the last thing I'd say with this is test them. So one thing that we do is, in addition to kind of having a formalized training structure, we'll do phishing simulations. So we'll actually send phishing simulations out that look like real phishing attacks. We'll take your security controls and allow this one through so it goes to users. We'll see what they do. Is the training working? Were they able to identify stuff? If they clicked on a link, did they give up their credentials? Do we have repeat offenders? Maybe we need to spend a little more time on. Or maybe the training's not working for them. We need to figure out a different training methodology. Maybe instead of a talking head, they want to play a game. Or maybe they learn a little bit differently. But either way, we need to test and make sure that people are actually following this and understanding it and implementing these practices. You can go beyond phishing simulations too. One of the fun ones that I like are there's ways to do QR code simulations where, the little symbols that you can scan at restaurants and stuff. a lot of times people just openly scan those and click on them. So you could put up some fake QR codes in your office, scan them, and see if people are clicking on them. You could also do a USB drop, which is one of my favorites. You write executive payroll on there, leave it in a bathroom somewhere, and see who plugs that USB drive into a computer and opens a file. So you
Those
can
are
really make sure
awesome.
people aren't attacked. Yeah.
Yeah, we do the simulated phishing attacks with our own staff on somewhat of a regular basis, but we've never tried the other things you suggested. And I think those would be great ideas to try.
Yeah, and if you ever come to a conference with us, sometimes we'll do stuff like that too and not tell everybody. If you ever see us sponsor a charging station, I would run.
Talk a little bit about endpoint detection and response. We hear that term a lot, and I think our clients would like to have a better understanding of what that is.
Yeah, endpoint detection and response you might see around as EDR. It's more and more a requirement for cyber liability policies, and also commonly a best practice or requirement for state and federal laws. So endpoint detection and response is a form of antivirus, and it might help to know maybe a little bit of the evolution of antivirus. I'll make it really quick. But originally we had antivirus a long time ago where it was just looking for a signature of a virus. It says, hey, I recognize that code. It's like it's DNA. I know this is a virus. It's in my library. Let's stop it. But then as new viruses came out, these tools needed to be more intelligent. So next gen antivirus started to add AI to that a little bit to look at the behaviors or heuristics of things running in your computer to see if it's a virus. So it doesn't necessarily recognize it, but it says, hey, this acts like a virus. I'm going to stop it. Then it goes to another level here with endpoint detection response. It takes that more to an endpoint level, and it gives you a centralized management system for the virus alerts and the threats that you're seeing at the endpoint for businesses to manage all of this. So the endpoint detection response starts to pull that more into a centralized database for everybody to see what's going on, because otherwise you're relying on your users to say, hey, my computer's telling me I have a virus. They don't update their computer. They're probably not going to raise the alert when their computer says it has a virus. So we want to make sure somebody else has access to that. The other thing that endpoint detection and response can do is it can look at the behaviors on the endpoint and say, this computer's operating at odd hours from what we usually see, or there's a lot of information going out of this endpoint, something else is going on. So it has more ways to look for that intelligence behind these threats. We're also seeing EDR take it further steps. So you'll start to see things out there like MDR or XDR, which would be managed detection response. I'm not sure what the X stands for. I think it's more of like a variable of different levels of detection and response that you can get where you actually have a third party starting to look at these alerts and ingest them and analyze them and see if it's a false alert or if it's something that needs to be acted upon. So EDR is kind of the beginning of this more involved antivirus and threat protection software. So more and more what people are required to have today.
So this is an example of AI being a very good, helpful thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. AI's been showing up in cybersecurity on both sides of the fence for a long time, but certainly in the defensive side, looking at things that can help us identify threats or odd behaviors and simplify the amount of information we have to look through as a human to analyze all of this. This information can happen so quickly when you turn on some of these things that go beyond. Another term for people to know, if you might see it, is a SIEM. Security is SIEM, Security Information and Event Management System. What that does is ingest tons of alerts and data, and if you don't have something that can help you parse through all of that, there's no sense in investing in something like that because you're just drinking from a fire hose constantly. So many things that you're getting information on just go right by you. Another level of this too is a security operations center or SOC, where you actually have people there 24/7 looking at these threats, deciding whether they need to take action and possibly taking action on them. But it's definitely the next evolution of what we can do to defend ourselves through AI and other tools.
Very good.
I will say real quick, for people using Microsoft Defender, if you're using that, make sure that you get Defender for Endpoint. It's usually a small little upcharge, but it gives you that EDR component and checks the box for your compliance. And that's a great product to be using.
Thank you so much. So if we can kind of, before we go to questions and answers, just kind of summarize, because we've talked about a lot of different things. what are the things that agencies should do as soon as they finish this session that's the most impactful for them?
Yeah. So I think a lot of this, we're talking about eating the elephant one bite at a time. And I think part of it is to realize this isn't something that just happens overnight and you're done. This is going to be an ongoing thing. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so I would think about a lot of this here to not become overwhelmed about the final destination of it. Just focus on one step at a time. What's one thing you can do every day to be a little bit better? You kind of think about like you would for improving your health. Maybe there's slight decisions you make about your diet and maybe small little tweaks. You decide not to have a cookie one day. Maybe you park a little further from the front of the store so you walk a little extra. But what are those little things you can be doing from cybersecurity standpoint? Some of that would be starting to understand your risks, understand what technology you're using, who's using it, what data's in there. The CIA I was talking about before, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. What does it mean for that system if I'm attacked? Do I have a sensitive data in there I need to protect? Do I have to trust the information in there? Or do I need to rely on that this system's going to be there when I need to use it for my business to function? Or is it all three of those or a combination of them? We need to start thinking about risks. That's going to help us understand where we're at on this roadmap of where we want to be. And it helps us understand how we use our budget and prioritize our energy here, because we want to focus on the highest area of risk first and reduce down. We're never going to get rid of it all, so we want to think about those little pieces we can work on. So start to think about your risk. And then I think another thing would be start to document your best practices. Things you're already doing, that's great, but you need to put it on paper to show that you're doing it. Explain the best practice would be the policy and procedure. The policy is your due diligence, what you intend to do. The procedure is your due care, how you intend to do it. So make sure that you explain what you're going to do and how you're going to do it in everything that you document, and then start to think about what you need to do to be quick to respond to attack. Many people know what they would do in a fire, but do you know what you would do if you had a cyber attack today? Figure that out, because you don't want to be in the middle of that fire trying to figure out what you're going to be doing. The next thing I would say, I think one of the biggest areas of risk for a lot of agencies they are outsourcing a lot of things. They're using cloud-based systems and other companies' technologies. They're integrating with partners. That is a big area of risk, but we have a lot of good partners in this industry. And if you're using different systems like Vertifor's AMS 360, go in there and turn on the controls that they give you. Make sure that all of those great security controls that are in your hands are being used, and that you're thinking about how these tools are being used as well. And even if you trust these companies, and I think there's a lot of reputational historical trust with these organizations, you still need to document that stuff just to show you did your work. Because again, if it ever comes down to you being in front of a judge having to explain everything that you've done here, you want to show you did your due diligence and say, look, we worked with this company, we put it on paper that they were doing all of these things, we did our part. But I think the biggest thing is looking at those third parties and figuring out what things you were given to turn on with that and make sure that you're using them. If you start with some of those things and some of the other stuff that we talked about already, that's going to put you in a really good position where you're starting to really get a little bit closer to where you want to be. And you have then a kind of a cycle you can kind of begin of, okay, we've addressed some risks. Now let's go back. What are our biggest risks today? Let's go back and address all these things and then go back again. Now what are our biggest risks? And you kind of continue that cycle over and over.
So we want to take some questions now, and we encourage you to put those in the chat feature, and we will answer those questions for as long as we have time remaining. So please take a few minutes, put your questions in chat, and we'd be happy to address those. And I'm sorry, the question should go in questions, not in chat. Sorry, that's just, I normally use chat, but in webinar, it's actually called questions.
All good, Angela. While we get some questions in here, we did have a few during the presentation itself. Let me find those real quick. Okay, here's one about cybersecurity laws. How do we know if we have any laws that impact us, and who notifies us?
This is Ryan. I'll jump in on that one. That's one of the challenging parts with all this is sometimes there's not somebody that's necessarily going to say, by the way, you have to do this. Now, I am seeing some people start to get letters. New York started to do this when they had first passed their 23 NYCRR 500, their cybersecurity rule that does apply to insurance agencies. And as they were going through licensing, they were looking for people that had certified that they had done everything. So there was a little bit of a checking point when licensing came up, but I'm not necessarily seeing that in other states. And I believe around 24 states today have a similar insurance-specific data law for their state that might impact you, even if you're just licensed there and don't do a lot of business. So you might have some things to do there. The things like the breach notification laws, though, things that are protecting consumers that are a little bit larger and wider, or even federal laws like HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, those laws really don't have any kind of proactive outreach or anything around them. So it's really, unfortunately, up to everybody to understand their requirements and to make sure that they're following them, because what might happen is you might be reached out to once you've had a problem, and then they're going to go back and look and see if you did everything. So you're expected to take accountability for yourself in there, unfortunately.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Uh, it, in no particular order here, another question. What are some good and trusted antivirus softwares that Rhodian recommends?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, we like Defender for Endpoint. There's also different levels of Microsoft where you have different versions of Defender. Defender for Business actually is a pretty comprehensive antivirus software that includes tools that can help with other Microsoft-related apps. So things like your email security, for example, Business Defender, Defender for Business has some solutions for that. In the past, we've used other tools like Bitdefender. I still think that's a great product. There are more advanced things you can look at too. CrowdStrike's very reputable. There's a lot out there. What I would be careful of is take a look at the application stacks that you have across different tools and make sure that they're compatible with it. And then also look at other overlapping capabilities in case you have things that are fighting against each other. Sometimes that can make things very difficult when you have multiple systems running. So I would recommend, since most people are using a Microsoft-based environment and Windows environments, to look at Defender for Business.
Mm-hmm. Kind of another recommendation question for MFA. Are there any authenticators that you do or don't recommend?
Yeah, I would run away from any free cybersecurity software out there. Usually, that's a trick to get people to sign up and enter sensitive information into that. So definitely be cautious when something's free in this realm. You kind of get what you pay for with cybersecurity, unfortunately. So sometimes the cheap option might just be there to trick people. Now, that being said, there are free MFA tools that you can get that I would say maybe kind of go against what I just said, but things like Authy, Ping, Duo, Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, all of these different tools give you an app that you can put on your phone that you can actually do a number matching authentication for. Now, the biggest trick with picking an MFA tool is not just watching out for people that might be malicious out there. You want to go with a reputable company, but you also want to make sure you think ahead about what's going to integrate with that tool. I personally use Authy. Main reason why is because I got set up on it a long time ago, and that's now what I have all of my MFA in. So it's the one app that I use for stuff. I think I still have some things out there in Google Authenticator, but I like to have everything in one place. So I have to think about, well, which app is this one working with, for this particular authenticator. So the biggest thing you can do is plan ahead, have consistency there. And then I think the other thing to think ahead about too is what would happen if you change devices. Are you keeping your backup codes and things like that? So that way, if you do have a new phone, you can set that up. But the authenticator that I use is Authy, again, AUTHY. I would also take a close look again at Microsoft's Authenticator that's newer, or Google Authenticator, or some of these other ones that you might already be using too. I'll put that Authy in the questions here. I see Jamie asked that question.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Mhm.
Have another question here. How can we prevent phishing email and how do we identify it?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's a couple layers of this. And so something we talked about a little bit earlier is defense in depth, or layers of security. So you want to do a couple things. First, I like to think about removing the users from the equation, that human element, as much as possible, but we can't ignore that it's there. So the first thing that I would say is make sure that you have some kind of a training system in place that is educating people on what to look for, and that you're doing it frequently enough so you can talk about more current types of attacks. We use a tool called KnowBe4, which is a product that we resell that is actually has a very extensive training, and we recommend that people do short quarterly trainings just to stay sharp on it. But we also recommend that they do phishing simulations on a regular basis, so that way they're able to make sure that people are actually learning from the training and able to take actionable steps to identify a phishing attack. So that's one component, making sure that your users are trained and tested on what a phishing email looks like and how to identify it. The next thing is what I was saying before, is try to remove the user from the equation altogether. So some other ways that we approach it is through using tools that can filter out phishing emails based on their language, using AI, or even just identifying malicious links in there. Now, some things are going to be inherently blocked by Outlook or Gmail, but those aren't necessarily reliable in themselves. They're usually not as advanced as other tools you can have to create that extra layer. So in the past, we've used tools like Great Horn Email Security that's helped us basically look for those little signs that might point towards something suspicious happening. For example, it might say, hey, you've emailed with Ryan before, but never from this email address. Or the language here sounds like somebody's tricking you into doing something with a wire transfer or something like that. So definitely having the technology help will be huge. The other thing that you should also look at are your own configurations and ways that you can stop yourself from being spoofed. And that goes into certain things that you can set up with your email system, whatever you're using. Some things to look into would be DKIM, DMARC, SPF. Those are configurations that basically authenticate that your email is coming from you. And so that can stop some spoof attacks too. There's a lot of in-depth stuff with that too. So anybody that has questions about this and really wants some one-on-one time with us too, we're of course always happy to spend time with you, help you understand more about your questions and your specific environment too, how they apply.
Angela, I saw you pop on just now. Did you have a question or a comment?
Just wanted to thank Ryan for all this great information. Thank all of you guys for attending. We want you to be as secure as you can be, and we know this is an area where we get a lot of questions, and having Ryan available to answer these questions is something we really appreciate.
Thank you, Angela. I'm happy to be here, and it's great to be working with you guys on such an important topic too. I know a lot of your clients have a lot of trust in you and your guidance in these areas. So we're happy that we were able to be a part of this, and certainly want to be there to help everybody else as well too. So if you do have direct questions for us here, I'll make sure you have my contact information. I'll drop it in the questions box, because it looks like that's what you guys can see. But certainly reach out and let us know what questions you have, even if it's about your IT infrastructure and some of the ways you're implementing cybersecurity. We have ways that can actually help you build a compliant and secure infrastructure into your IT setup itself. So that's something we can also look at for you as well.
I want you guys, especially our accountant clients, to know how seriously we take the trust that you've placed in us to keep your data safe. And we are always looking at ways to improve that. If that's something you're interested in or want to have a conversation with us about, please reach out. And again, Ryan, thank you for your time in doing this with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love talking about this stuff. I love all the different questions that come up about it. I think there's a lot of things that agencies today could benefit from if they start to focus in these areas. So the folks that are here on the webinar that are learning about this, that are taking the active point to look into this and learn more about it, that's great. That's putting you into a category above others. So kudos to you that are here. And if we can help in any way with any questions you have, let us know. I did put my contact information in the chat. I'm not sure if everybody can see that, but if you need it, it's rsmith@rhodiangroup.com. You can also get to us at info@rhodiangroup.com.
Thank you.